Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is November 18th, 2023. And let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? Let's go first to Horivka. And this is a city that we seldom talked about. The reason being that simply there haven't been any changes around this area since, prior to 2022. You can see that in the dark red is what the Russians controlled prior to the massive invasion in 2022. And the reason being why I'm going here is that the Ukrainians had some success northwest of the city of Horivka, and they managed to push out and open the lines here around the area of Pivdenne and Shume. And this is a spoil tip. So all these little small hills are actually spoiling tips that were used for a huge chemical plant that exists in Horivka. I believe it is now abandoned, obviously, but the Ukrainians took a good position here. I'm not saying this is a huge breakthrough, but this is positive because it shows that these heavy Russian fortifications that were supposed to be throughout the front line, there are some weaknesses in certain areas, and the Ukrainians can get into also these older Russian defenses. Additionally, let's go to Avdiivka. So again, this is really where the heaviest fighting is ongoing right now. The Russians want to change the momentum in their direction, and they're counting on just massive ground meat assaults to be able to exhaust the Ukrainians. Again, for the past now we're 5 weeks in of this huge offensives that the Russians have launched. They haven't encircled Avdiivka, and they have not taken Avdiivka. However, in the north is where the Russians are having partial success, but it's not really super meaningful because, again, what they have pushed and what they managed to gain are just fields. As I said previously, what would be concerned is if the Russians manage to take settlements. This is going to allow them to have assembly points for weapons, regroupings, and continuously launch further attacks on other settlements and eventually encircle the Ukrainians. If they have success in that direction, meeting these objectives, then yes, I believe the Ukrainian forces need to withdraw from Avdiivka. So far as you can see, the Russians have only liberated the fields. Liberated, of course. We know that the Russians don't liberate anything; they destroy everything in their path. But around the area of Krasnohorivka, now, as of the 14th, you can see that they held these fields that were sort of west of the city of Krasnohorivka, and they managed to push out in both directions. So the north and in the south of Krasnohorivka, but not in the center. And you can see that the proximity towards Stepove is quite close. So the Russians are desperately trying to take this small little village of Stepove. And what really divides the Ukrainian positions and the Russian positions is this railway line. Now, it's under the Russian control, but essentially after that, the Russians haven't been really able to have success and really push out the Ukrainians because they have strong defensive positions around Stepove and Berdichi and other areas that are dense. Lastochne, Avdiivka. So the Ukrainians are really holding this line, and they cannot allow the Russians to overextend themselves and continue, having a lot of leverage in the north. Right, the Ukrainians need to be able to hold on into the settlements here. So we'll see how that develops. But so far, uh, clearly everything's going terrible for the Russians. They have lost thousands of men in the last 5 weeks. Now, Zaluzhny talked about 10,000 casualties, Russian casualties in this direction. We've seen the videos of these hundreds of armored vehicles being destroyed by the Ukrainian forces in the last 5 weeks. It's been catastrophic for the Russians. They've really went all in into Avdiivka. And again, I'm not really seeing what the end goal is, right? It's a lot of pro-Russian trolls will talk about, Avdiivka will be ours, but what is the next step afterwards? You have wasted so many resources, so many men, so much morale will be lost just to take a city that was prior to the war barely 30,000 people, right? And we see that the Russian capabilities have been going down ever since 2022. In the beginning, it was going quite well for the Russians. They had this surprise attack. They were able to take vast amounts of territory and cities. And the biggest one for them was actually Mariupol, right? Which they still control. Over 400, 500,000 Ukrainian people lived in Mariupol. Then, after the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the entire front line, the Russians launched a huge attack around Lysychansk and essentially Severodonetsk. I forgot the name of the city, but Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. And you guys remember the fighting here was brutal. The Russians were launching about 50 to 60,000 shells, according to some reports, every single day at the Ukrainian positions. So this entire front line, Lysychansk, Kremina, was very difficult. The Ukrainians had to eventually withdraw because it was just way too intense. So that was a city of about 70 to 80,000 people. And then they went into Bakhmut earlier, this year, and it took them 8 to 9 months to take Bakhmut. And this is another city of about 80 to 90,000 people. And now we're talking about a city of 30,000 people that the Russians are not able to take. So you can see that their capabilities go down more and more. And I think this is the last time the Russians will be able to do such a push, in my opinion, as the Ukrainians also at the same time are building up a massive force of FPV drones, which are more precise and they can create a lot of destruction. And I think this is what's really been able to equalize essentially the fighting. Is the Ukrainians clearly don't have as many men as Russia does, but the Ukrainians can fly these drones and kill 3 times, 4 times more the men than a regular Russian infantryman can. Now, that's not to say that the Russians don't have any drone flying capabilities. They have been building and modernizing their Lancet drones, which have been effective. They also have been copying the Ukrainian forces in terms of FPV drone, and the Shahid drone they're producing now. They've built their own factory, or are almost finished at building their factory in Tatarstan of these Iranian Shahid drones, and that is worrisome as well. But that is just to say that the Russians also have drone capabilities, but they're not as good as the Ukrainians. I believe that the Ukrainians have really pioneered, this specific weapon, and the Russians are only catching up now. And I think that the Ukrainians are more skilled, they are more determined. So I think that the Ukrainians still have an advantage over the drones. And these drones have really made a difference in Avdiivka. Truly, I think without these drones, the Russians might have been already able to encircle the city of Avdiivka at this point. So these FPV drones, these nighttime drones that the Ukrainians are flying in this specific front line have been extremely important and game-changing for the Ukrainian forces. So that is Avdiivka. The north, the Russians are having partial success, just taking some fields. In the center as well, the Russians have moved in a little bit closer to Avdiivka, around the area of Kashtanove. So you can see that yesterday, or the 16th, this was still a great area. Now the Russians have moved in. A little bit of this area was gained by the Russians. And I think I've seen a video of Ukrainian Bradley actually rolling in and kind of destroying Russian positions. So I think that this is a very great area. And so far, the Russians have not been able to have these massive breakthroughs that they expected to have. And the south of Avdiivka has been a total catastrophe for them. Again, they have not had any success in the last few days here. The front line remains the same around the area of Vodyane Pervomayske for the Russians. So Avdiivka is holding on, and the Ukrainians are doing everything possible to kill as many orcs as possible. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Kherson. And in Kherson, there's a new report saying that the Russians have, up since the beginning of the Ukraine operations to try to cross to the left bank, there have been 3,500 Russian casualties, and that includes the wounded or missing in action. So again, the fighting here is not as big compared to Zaporizhia or Donetsk or Luhansk. So, of course, here the Russian losses will be much more smaller. They are hoping on this natural defense, which is the Dnieper River, to be able to hold the line. And you can see that there's not as many Russian forces present in Kherson compared to, as you can see, the insanity of Zaporizhia and Avdiivka, Donetsk. You can see the sheer concentration of Russian troops here and in Zaporizhia compared to Kherson, which is quite small. So the Russians really hope that they can hold the line with what they have. And again, as I said, the Ukrainian FPV drones have been instrumental because they have a very long range. They can go as far as now 20 kilometers, which is pretty crazy. And again, what is the biggest advantage of a drone is its how precise it is. It is literally guided by a Ukrainian operator who can see everything. They can go underneath underpasses, through windows, even inside of a BMP if necessary, to destroy Russian soldiers. So they have been instrumental. And so now there are rumors as well that the Russians are now planning a regrouping, essentially not being so close to the left bank by the shores of the Dnieper River and just really moving further away because they're being hammered by first person view drones, Ukrainian special forces that are present here, and they simply don't have the capacity to hold the line. So it will be interesting to see where the Russians regroup. I believe it would be closer, obviously, to the this other highway that connects all Hola Prestan all the way up to Tavrisk, which is in Novakhovka. So this would be potential area where the Russians would regroup, essentially do a goodwill gesture again. So that's pretty much it for the frontline updates, or the big ones, in the last few days. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things as well. So there was a report by the Telegraph yesterday that talked about the quality of North Korean shells. If you guys remember, North Korea transferred 1 million or up to 1 million different types of shells and ammunition to the Russians, which is clearly concerning because it allows Russia to continue on with its offensive. And I think right after that, the Russians launched their offensive in Avdiivka. So I believe that this transfer of ammunition and resources was directly tied to Russia trying to muster one last big offensive. But the good news is that the quality of these North Korean shells is actually substandard, and the Russians have now been complaining that this ammunition, um, sometimes they don't fit the barrels, their dimensions are off, and they can cause premature barrel explosions. So overall, this is very positive. The less of these shells and ammo that is functional, the better it is for the Ukrainians and easier it is for Ukraine to defend itself. And clearly, it shows how desperate, again, the Russians are. They wouldn't be going to North Korea or China or Iran had they had a good, successful, not only offensive, but a successful military industrial complex, right? But they simply don't. And so they have to be desperate and go to, their partner countries to be able to resupply its forces in Ukraine. The other update I have is also now in Finland, and that is quite interesting. So Finland decided that it will close its border between Russia and Finland. Now, yesterday was a news article that said it was 4 out of the 8 border crossings that will be closed. Now I think it's all of them, and that is a result of Russia essentially pushing illegal migrants into Finland, trying to destabilize Finland and create chaos within the European Union, because nothing stops these illegals to then go to different European Union countries and destabilize these regions, because who knows who they are, right? And so they're people from Iraq, Syria, and other Middle Eastern other countries that have nothing to do with Finland. And this is again the same tactic that is being currently employed. Is what was applied between Belarus and Poland. If you guys remember, in late 2021, early 2022, Lukashenko, by the order of Putin, did exactly the same thing at the border of Belarus and Poland, which caused a lot of destabilization, a lot of chaos within Poland. It had to scramble, police and even its own troops to be able to control the border. And so I think that it's another way Putin is trying to destabilize the European Union, European countries, and good on Finland to completely close off the border. I fully support that. And now the Russians are denouncing it. The pro-Russians in Finland are also denouncing it. But I think it's a good move because we know the history of Finland and Russia, which is very similar to what is currently ongoing with Ukraine. Russia trying to bite off more and more Finnish land, and I think that they also have the same aspirations today. Nothing has changed. So this massive 1,300 kilometer border between Finland and Russia is being completely shut off. So that's good news. And lastly, we're going into Central Asia to talk about Kazakhstan. And this is another indication that Kazakhstan is not interested to be Russia's partner. Tokayev is quietly trying to withdraw the Russian sphere of influence in its own country. And I see that as a very positive thing because Kazakhstan, naturally, because it shares a massive border with Russia, has a huge flow of Russians into its own country. And there's a very big influence influence of Russian language as well in Kazakhstan. And so I see that as a very positive thing that Tokayev is trying to get rid of this Russian sphere of influence. And what he did yesterday was basically shut off the Sputnik 24 sort of live stream service, which provides free channels such as NTV, Russia 1, Russia 24. So these big propaganda channels, they're being shown in Kazakhstan and brainwashing people. So they have shut that off as well. So this is a very good development as well. It shows that Kazakhstan wants to be closer to the West and doesn't want to have any Ruski Mir in their own country. And unfortunately, Tokayev has to do in a very quiet, sort of almost secretive way, so it doesn't get really noticed by Russia. But I think that it's just a result of Kazakhstan being much weaker than Russia and not being able to, if anything was to happen, to hold on to this massive front line, this border, I should say, that they have with Russia. But anyways, that is good news. So that's the update for today, guys. Let me know what you think about the Finnish border crossing being closed for Russian movement. Let me know what you guys think about the situation in Avdiivka. Let me know I want to hear about your comments. I'm always interested in reading them out. And again, a huge thank you for your support. I'm really grateful for your support. Like my video if you enjoy my content, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you, and Slava Ukraini.